Good afternoon, everyone. We're joined here with Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, and we're going to be having a conversation about gun violence and how to engage the youth in the upcoming election. Before we get into it, allow me to introduce myself and my fellow panelists. My name is Jacyln Corin. I am calling in from Parkland, Florida, and I am an original co-founder of March for Our Lives.
Hello, my name is Trevon Bosley. I'm from Chicago, Illinois. I got involved with the violence prevention movement in April 4th, 2006, when my brother Terrell Bosley was shot and killed at church. And I'm part of the Brave Youth Leaders here in Chicago, and now I'm a member of the Student Congress in March for Our Lives.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tatiana. I am from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm a state policy associate with March for Our Lives. And I also do work at 50 Miles More here in Milwaukee.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. All right, well, we'll jump into it. My first question for Senator Booker is, how can we get more federal funding for violence intervention programs for gun violence prevention?
Look, the reality is you get, what did Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a demand. And we know what works in our communities. There are so many evidence-based examples when we have federal funding for violence prevention programs. I've done a lot of things from my Senate seat advocating for those resources. I have a bill called Break the Cycle of Violence Act that would provide federal funding for those specific evidence-based programs. So what's working around the country? And by the way, for federal dollars you invest in programs like that, it saves taxpayers and society multiple more than that when you actually lower that violent crime. And this act, the Break the Cycle of Violence Act, would provide, a lot of federal communities, grants to a lot of communities that experience 20 or more homicides a year and have a homicide rate that's at least twice the national average. So I could go through with you a lot about the specific things we can do, but I want to get back to that first thing, which is Frederick Douglass's advice. We have to know, and I know the folks listening know this, because there has been not a single great act done by Washington. I'm talking about the momentous acts, whether it's suffrage or civil rights or voting rights or workers' rights, that was not preceded by activism, by people taking to the streets, by people finding ways to be creative artists of activism, finding new ways to protest and demand change. There's an old saying that says change doesn't come from Washington, it comes to Washington. And so there are advocates and allies in elected positions in Washington. I hope there are more. I hope people listening to me will run for office. We clearly need to change office holders. But remember, the consistency of history means that if we're going to get these anti-violence programs funded, we have to be more concerted and concentrated and focused in our efforts to demand that the funding comes. Because I'm tired of seeing us spend so much money on the back end of problems when we could spend a fraction of it on the front end of problems that would reduce violence overall. And a lot of the wisdom, I hope, the circles of empathy and understanding coming out of the George Floyd protests, Breonna Taylor protests, the protests that we're seeing Black Lives Matter and other organizations push, is this understanding that we could reduce the need for so much law enforcement if we make the effort to invest in the things that would actually create real, true public safety and a lack of the need for so much policing in our communities overall.
And my question, I just want to preface it, as you know, like gun violence in Chicago and other inner cities like Chicago is happening on the daily. And many people are like hopeless when it comes to policies and other things in Washington changing the situations we have here, because it's happening so fast and policy tends to move pretty slowly for the most part. So what can politicians and senators and congressmen and women, what can they be doing in the now to try to solve the solution to everyday gun violence in most inner city communities?
Well, when you ask specifically what can the elected leaders in Congress or the Senate or politicians in general can do, and I hear you when you say things move slowly, and they do. They move slowly until they don't. remember, a lot of the discussions about John Lewis, the Voting Rights Act was painfully not moving, slow, but it was the protesters on the Edmund Pettus Bridge that ignited a very quick change. And LBJ was the president back then, President Johnson, and suddenly it moved. So things move slowly until they don't, and then there's leaps forward. And one of my strategies as a senator is always to be looking for the opening that we can hit to move things forward that are going to make a big difference in communities. People told me it would be impossible to pass criminal justice reform and take a whack at mass incarceration in our country. But I built coalitions and worked together with other senators to bring more people to the table. And we eventually got very big legislation done that liberated thousands of people from prison, disproportionately Black and brown people. And so I'm hoping that what we can do is build broader coalitions around ending of gun violence. And know we're in the majority. The majority of Americans agree with us on doing a lot of the things that we've been talking about, which is the investing in evidence-based programs, investing in violence intervention strategies, investing in things that are basic that we know. There's actually a reduction in violence when you expand Medicaid. There's actually a reduction in violence when you expand feeding programs or SNAP benefits. And so these correlations that lower violence are things that we have to push for. And so I just want to keep coming back to the same theme because I know I'm talking to activists, but young people have always been at the center of driving the change of politicians. One of my favorite moments in history, I know we tend to hail Martin Luther King as the great man that he was. He was far more radical than the watered down image of King that we talk about often today. But King in Birmingham in 1963 was failing to get people to organize. And it was a couple of his younger lieutenants, James Bevel and Dorothea Cotton, young people in their 20s that came to him and said, change your strategy. And they challenged him, and they did change their strategy. And they allowed younger people to demonstrate. And they had kids 8 years old to 18-year-olds now demonstrating in front of Bull Connor, who unleashed fire hoses and dog horns. But it so took up the civil rights movement that it ignited the consciousness of this country. And next thing you know, the politicians, the white politicians in Birmingham completely changed and gave up on segregation. Segregation fell. So I just think that the moment we're in American history is no less urgent. I live in a Black and brown, low-income community where we don't mistake wealth with worth. In a community that is similar to many of the communities in Chicago. We don't have time to wait. Every day we're losing brothers and sisters to gun violence, horrific gun violence. I've been to too many funerals where I see what is now a part of American culture, which is young Black boys in boxes. And so we have the same urgencies of the generation before that civil rights generation. And we as creative artists have to find ways to drive the moral imagination of our country, to get folk woke, so that this is not a matter of can we reduce violence in America. It's the fact that we have not yet mustered the collective will. And that is the job of elected leaders like myself. But it's also the job of unelected leaders who have to, in this time, assume the mantle of leadership. Because the most common way people give up their power is not realizing they have it in the first place. And the power of the people will always be greater than the people in power if we're willing to assume that mantle of leadership and exercise the power we have to change the realities in which we live.
Thank you so much, Senator. Violence intervention work is usually implemented and funded on the local level. But given that you are a United States Senator and that we're in the midst of a presidential election cycle, what can be done on the federal level to stop gun violence that disproportionately affects Black and brown communities?
Well, I think that there has to be a federal response. And I agree with you, though, that what's happening on local levels is really important. But I believe that on the federal level, we could be providing a lot more resources to those evidence-based programs I've talked about before. For example, research has shown that a combination of community-oriented intervention programs, common sense gun violence policies, and other things that improve the wellness and well-being of populations can really cut gun violence in cities in as little as half in just a few years. So we know that there are fundamentally the things that we can do on the federal level. And so the question is what are we willing to fund? We just, in the middle of a pandemic, we just approved a military funding. I voted against the bill overall. We are, as a country, spend more in the next 10 countries combined on military spending. When, if you think about this, it was talked about as a defense bill, to the national defense. If you think about what's happening with gun violence in our country, is that we have had more people die in the last 50 years from gun violence than every one of our wars combined. So we are a nation that finds the resources to invest in things that are supposed to keep us safe, but we're not investing in those things that actually will reduce gun violence and death in our community. So the federal government has trillions of dollars that they're investing every single year, but we are not investing in those things that would keep us safer and actually reduce the overall cost to our society. And so this is about federal priorities, because your budget not only reflects your priorities, but it reflects your values. And I believe we need to reconfigure of what it really means to keep Americans safe and sustain what is the national defense. And the more we can get into this enlightened understanding, that can affect our policies. And I would be remiss if I didn't tell folks of the value of the electoral process. Because if young people voted at the same level that the baby boomers vote, just the agenda of young folks on everything from climate change to reducing gun violence, I don't care what party you identify with, young people are far more progressive on these issues than older Americans are, and they exercise a lot more electoral power. And so one of the things we have to do is a fundamental element of citizenship is to vote so that we have more of a voice in what goes on in Washington. And then number two is never stop honoring the activism of the past, the sacrifices, the struggle, the blood, sweat, and tears of past activists. We have to continue that same level of activism now to ensure that we continue to drive the change at the federal level we need.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that answer. And one final question for you before we let you go. How do we make sure that voter messaging is approachable to communities that haven't had civic education?
That's a tough question, because I know that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and I know Senate campaigns, presidential campaigns will be spending hundreds of millions of dollars on messaging in this election. And I'm not in those inner circles of some of the races going on around our country. I guess the one thing I always think about is, how am I messaging? You know, all of us who have more than 10 followers on social media, we are all messengers. We syndicate information every single day. And I always challenge people to do an audit of what you post and see if you are really posting in accordance to your highest self and posting in the way of the urgencies of the moment. So I think that we have to take responsibility for answering your question, which is making sure that we are elevating messages and doing the messaging necessary to get to the heart and the spirit of all Americans, regardless of their background. We got to have messaging that gets folk woke. We got to have messaging that makes people feel uncomfortable sometimes. And we have to have messaging that is persuasive to many people who are surrendering to the seduction of cynicism, where they somehow believe that what they do doesn't matter. And God, where we would be if young activists in the civil rights movement just said, nothing I do can make a difference. Or if young activists in the suffrage movement said, nothing I can do make a difference. Or if activists during the AIDS crisis, when the Reagan administration was doing nothing on that pandemic, if the great young activists said, oh, there's nothing I can do to change my government. And so we have to somehow prevent the do-nothingness or the bystander mentality or the cynicism that infects a lot of our circles of friends, and somehow be determined and conscious and purposeful in our messaging, especially in these last 85 days before the most consequential election of the lifetime of anybody who's living right now. And so I'm going to think a lot as a senator. I'm running my reelection campaign in New Jersey about how to appropriately message. But at the end of the day, we have seen how creative messaging amongst people with platforms, that often can make a bigger difference in the behavior of your peers than anything they see through messaging on the TV or on the radio or the YouTube ads between the videos that we watch. So I just challenge you all. I've seen the social science data that the most persuasive people in an election are those who are directly connected, who know you. In other words, I can far greater influence a friend of mine than any TV ad that they're going to see. Mm-hmm. And those of us with circles that are in the hundreds should understand that when they post something, it makes a difference. And we should all be far more determined in the messaging that we send out and the programming of the channels that we curate every single day.
Definitely. I totally agree with that. Well, thank you again for your time. I know I speak for all of us when I say we so appreciate your advocacy both in and out of Congress. And that's it for our gun violence panel.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. It's really good to be on you. You guys encourage me more than you know. And as a person who has been directly affected by gun violence in my life, in my neighborhood, whether it's Shahad Smith, who was murdered at the top of my block, a young man I watched grow up with an assault rifle, to just, as I said before, seeing too many young people in my community. The work that you do is so vital and so inspiring, and the fact that you've sustained a movement with such strength. You all are so much of my hope for our ability together to change our reality and to truly bring peace to our nation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for listening to our panel. I want to bring up, it's really important that we all hold every single elected official accountable, whether it's our local elected officials or our ones in Congress, to really address the root causes of gun violence.
And thank you, everybody, for watching and viewing and listening to our discussion. And violence is happening in communities around the country every day. And you can be making an impact, whether that's donating funds or just being involved in the movement. So make sure you're getting out and being active.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely. And I think we all can, take from that conversation we just listened to, and talk about it with our friends, our neighbors, our family, to make sure we all go and vote in November and in the primaries leading up to that day. It's so important that we exercise our civic duty if we are eligible to do so. And now we're going to bring it to my good friend David Hugg's video on voting. Enjoy.